All right, welcome to Delivery Conf. Y'all having fun so far? Yeah, you having a good time, getting some good talks? How many people here have heard about new and shiny things so far? I see maybe like 5, 6 hands. Guess what? I'm not here to talk about new and shiny things. Yay! I'm actually here to talk about legacy pipelines and legacy applications. My name is Santamaria. I am a developer advocate at LogDNA, but I'm mostly here to talk about a prior job where I used to work on legacy pipelines. First question, how many people here have a legacy pipeline that they work on? Hey, maybe about a third of the room? Don't be shy, you can raise those hands higher. That's okay. How many people here have never touched a legacy pipeline? No hands are going, oh, one hand is going up. Be brave, be bold, put it right up there. Guess what? You will see one. So, the first thing I want to talk about, though, is what is legacy? A lot of people assume that means, oh, hey, it's old. Guess what? That's not the case. Legacy can mean a lot of things. More likely than not, it's unmaintained, meaning that no one's out there making sure that it's up to date. No one's making sure that if it falls over, it goes back up. Or if it is, it's one person who, when someone screams, they just go, hey, here, poof, back up it goes. But it's typically unmaintained and outdated. You might have actually lost the knowledge of how it was built and how it is all put together because the person who built it left the company or they left the group that's running it. You also may have those lovely hidden computer boxes underneath someone's desk that you really hope that no one actually pulls the plug so that it keeps running. Typically, those are found when someone starts screaming because someone unplugged it to start doing some vacuuming. A little bit of chuckles out there. All right, y'all are kind of awake. Maybe we need a little more coffee. Also, it may be unstable, but that is not necessarily a definition of a legacy pipeline. It might be quite stable in its older configuration. But the one thing that it is not is old. And why do I say that? Well, I have a little story for you. When I started at a tiny little company called Rackspace, I was handed a legacy pipeline. It was also a legacy application. But it was using all sorts of different technologies, all sorts of different languages in there. So up there on the screen, we have CoreOS, we have Ansible, we have Docker, Node.js, Python, Ruby, Elasticsearch, Mongo, and a tiny little one that I'm going to get to in just a moment. This system was my first production system that I ever handled. I was a junior dev. And it was a little bit interesting because most of the team had left the company, or they had moved on to other things. There were a couple people left. And no one really knew how it worked except for this one person. And his last week was my first week at the company. That's right. I also was a junior dev. So hey, imagine getting dumped into your very first production system as a junior dev with no information on how exactly this thing worked. It only had been built about a year or two before I started, so it wasn't old, but it was outdated. For reference, Elasticsearch is probably the most popular one up there that I can talk to. It was running 1.7. I hear some chuckles out in the audience already. For those of you who don't know Elasticsearch, currently they're on 6.2. Slight problem. So here I was with a production pipeline that was legacy that I didn't have a lot of information on. And by the way, there's a tiny little icon on here that you probably didn't recognize. And that one is for an open source product called Strider CD. Strider was a plug-in, I guess you could say, something that you could replace Jenkins with. It ran Node.js, so it was a continuous delivery pipeline. What I didn't know is that we modified it, because that's what you do, I guess, when you have a production system that you want to mess with. And Didn't have a lot of great documentation because it was open source, very tiny, hard to get people there. So I learned that I didn't know as much as I thought I did about this legacy pipeline. So, as with any good legacy system, what's the very first thing that it does? It breaks. So the very first time that it broke, I didn't have access to anything on production. I had no logs, no data, just a little bit of documentation and all of the information around the development. I, of course, panicked. And the very first thing I did was probably the one thing that I hope you take away. I asked for help. There was an engineering manager who had been working on the project that was still at the company. He was working on something completely different, had no real time for me. But I said to him, Ken, if I give you a beer, will you help me figure this out? Ken, I know you're probably somewhere out there. If you happen to be in this audience, I do still owe you that beer. So I learned a lot about what not to do when troubleshooting a legacy pipeline, which includes changing the password on one of the servers when you don't realize that all the other servers require the same password to access it. Not only did I manage to take down staging, I took down production. Very good job on my case. So that was the first time that it broke. Also, right after we got that up and back and running, I then had to do the next thing, which was deploy it. We didn't have a lot of information on deploying it, but I sat there overnight. Again, I bribed Ken with a beer to sit there with me while I triggered some Ansible playbooks and crossed my fingers and hoped that I didn't take down everything. Thankfully, I did not take down everything. And I like to believe it got easier as I started working with this legacy pipeline. I started understanding how it worked. I learned a lot about how to do it, and we're going to talk about some of those ideas that I came up with. But probably what's more likely is I just got used to this thing breaking a lot. I found out about components that I didn't know we were relying on, other people's systems. So in short, this whole story is exactly how I figured out what to do with a legacy pipeline. So I'd like to talk about some of the good ideas we figured out together, Ken and I, as well as what else I did to make it easier. The very first thing was I started out by making a map. Up here on the screen is a diagram. The diagram itself doesn't really matter, but the basic idea is I took all of the different components that I had, and I started trying to understand how do they all connect. So I had the user interfacing with my pipeline. I knew that was the end, but what was the start? This was a documentation delivery pipeline. It took code from a repo, put it through a number of steps, which includes a preparer, a CI/CD system that then sent it from the preparer to the submitter to a content service, and finally a presenter. And by the way, just as a note, this system ran, as I said, the documentation for a place whose tagline was the home of fanatical support. Imagine handing a junior dev a production pipeline that runs all of your documentation that your support floor relies on 24/7, 365 for thousands of customers daily. Brilliant idea. I still love you. But in any event, we were running all sorts of crazy things here, and so what I'd encourage you to do when you're first handed a legacy pipeline is make a map and know that it never will be finished. You are going to continuously be adding components to this pipeline as you find more and more data. Now, how did I get to this map? I checked everything that I could find that was written down. And that's everything. I got very lucky. The team who built this relied on an open development model. And what I mean by that is every single architectural decision they ever made was documented in GitHub issues and GitHub pull requests. So I had a lot of data. I also had all of my logs from how the system was running once I finally did get access to production. They also, as you would hope for with a documentation delivery pipeline that's open source, had good documentation. Yes, good documentation is a good thing for that sort of pipeline. So it wasn't completely updated, but I used it as a starting point to generate my map. Now, let's say that you can't get anything written down. You have a pipeline and it was just really in someone's head, and you try to figure out, okay, well, what do I do with this? Well, build a sample pipeline. That was actually the next thing that I did. I actually was lucky. I got access to a sample pipeline that I was able to work with. Further legacy systems that I took over, I ended up building a sample pipeline to understand how it worked. And then, of course, I tried knocking it over. You have to understand what will cause it to fail to be able to make a good map. Just like making a good map is finding all of your dead ends. So I realized that, for example, I tried disconnecting the database. I got logs on that, and I saw what happened to the pipeline. It fell over, by the way. What happened to that pipeline when I disconnected that database? Those logs I could then compare to the production system, and then I updated my maps. Building it locally is a thing. If you can set it up with virtualization, you can get at least a skeleton working, especially if you're dealing with a system that, let's say for financial reasons, you can't duplicate on the scale that it's running. A sample pipeline that's a skeleton is almost as good as having a full-blown prototyping system. So, with those in mind, I also discovered a lot of dependencies. Not with this specific project, but with another one. I found out about another legacy system that was an identity server that happened to be plugged in underneath someone's desk. I found out the hard way what happens when that server got unplugged, and I then immediately added it to my map. Finding all of these dependencies of all the systems that your pipeline relies on, all the interconnected bits and pieces that you have out there in your company, is going to be really important when you get to the next phase. I don't think any of us here has ever been handed a legacy pipeline, system, application, what have you, and been said, just keep it running, right? We all are asked, how can you modernize this system? How can you resurrect it so that it will continue to work exactly as we want it to on newer platforms, newer systems, shinier things? And what I want to say about that is this pipeline that you've been handed probably has been running for at least some time. And everybody expects it to kind of just run. So you need to prioritize the stability of your pipeline as you're modernizing it. The end user should never see a difference. Exactly like we heard in the keynote this morning, the end user is important. So here, when you're prioritizing stability, maybe you're sitting there and building out a prototype and not changing the expectation of what the end user sees. In my case, we ended up building one right next to it, and the user started seeing test results coming back, information coming back from the new pipeline, just like the old one. And we used that to validate that they were the same, but the end result that the user had never changed. They always saw the same stable system. In addition, if you don't work well under pressure, prioritizing stability on your legacy pipeline as you're modernizing it probably will keep people from coming and breathing down the back of your neck asking when it's going to be back up again. Just a small thought that you might want to consider. Once you've prioritized the stability of the system and you have this system handed to you, the next thing you really need to ask the person who said to you, hey, can we modernize this and use, I don't know, let's say we're going to be using Docker and we're going to be using Circle CI, no offense to any of those programs, but you need to actually ask, is the modernization of this platform worth it? Maybe it's still stable if you just at least update the systems that are there. Let's say it's running on an older version of Java. Could you just come in and update the version of Java? Let's say if you're running Jenkins, could you just update the version of Java, update Jenkins, but it still works? If it does, maybe that's good enough. So you should ask that. In my case, for decons, we realized there were a lot of security vulnerabilities that were coming down the pike. We needed to modernize to ensure this pipeline stayed secure. In addition, one of the things that's lovely about CoreOS, for those of you who don't know CoreOS, is that it updates itself. One of the bad things about CoreOS, for those of you who don't know CoreOS, is that it updates itself. What I didn't realize at the time, and I figured out fairly quickly, was that we were using undocumented APIs on the networking side. So when CoreOS updated itself and etcd got updated, guess what broke? Dconst. And we had a lot of troubleshooting to do. So in my case, I found out modernization was worth it. In addition, I was asked to add bits and pieces. We needed to be able to take in new documentation. So one of the next things you need to do when you're considering modernizing a legacy pipeline is add components to that pipeline very carefully. Because guess what? You are not the last person who is going to be working on this pipeline. Someone coming down the pike after you is going to be really, really annoyed if everything else is written in Java and you decided to add your component in Go. Yes, exactly. We do not want to add them in and make it hard for the next person. So consider how you're building things. In my case, the next component that I added, I took a look at older components that were still there. And I said, OK, I'm going to package up my component exactly the same. I'm going to set it up using the same version of Python, which I updated on both sides, by the way. We're going to set it up with the same version of Python. We're going to set it up in the same architectural method, whether I agree with it or not. Is it working? Yes. Is it stable? Yes. So therefore, I continue to make it the new component in the same method. And finally, you need to think about what tooling you're using. And here's where I probably get into trouble with all of you. How many people here hate Jenkins? Raise your hand. OK, about half the room. How many people here love Jenkins? All right, thank you. There's like 3 hands up in the room. How many people don't care? OK, so, okay, about half. The thing about all of these lovely tools that we now have for CI/CD, for continuous delivery, for any pipeline, really, is that a lot of them are new. Jenkins has been around for a while. It's probably going to work with your legacy system because someone else has already done the work of shoehorning it into your use case. So while, yes, we might love having these brand new and shiny things, you may need to just stick with the tooling that works and be able to add in new bits and pieces like feature flags, canary releases, blue-green deployments. Jenkins can still do that. In addition, you might be able to do some virtualization. So for example, I think it's Travis recently did a partnership with IBM where you can now build artifacts for mainframes. Yes, mainframes are still a thing. So you might need to think about what tools are the most effective for what you need. No matter what, you should still have a prototype system that you're testing it out on so that you're sure anything you introduce as you're modernizing the system does not break the stability of your pipeline. Just as I said before, prioritizing stability and asking whether it's worth it. So, in the end, I want to show you the difference in my maps. There were a lot of intermediate bits and pieces, for sure, but we went from that original map that was fairly small, had a few components, little bits and pieces, to something a lot more complicated. Now, for those of you who can't see the screen, we have different bits and pieces up there. I have 3 different maps. The top left map is showing one part of the pipeline, because it turns out what I didn't know about this legacy system is there were actually 2 pipelines running. So I had to make 2 separate maps. So the first one is showing all of the different interactions for Jenkins and OpenShift. And then the one on the far, I guess this would be your right, my left, is showing another version for the second pipeline. And then the final one is going to show how everything is all interconnected. What I want to point out about this is I went from running CoreOS with Docker within Docker. Yes, I was running Docker within Docker. I heard that what out in the audience. The original version was running CoreOS with Docker within Docker using Strider CD to do all of its orchestration, because Strider was running in a Docker container, and it was spinning up Docker containers within it to run all of the preparers and the submitter and all these fun things. I went from that to OpenShift with Jenkins doing the orchestration, but I no longer had Docker within Docker, and I no longer had to deal with the CoreOS getting updated underneath me with something that was going to break it. In addition, we were able to add feature flags because I understood my map. I understood how I could add those bits and pieces in so that I didn't break the pipeline and I just kept it running. In addition, we were able to add in a canary release where one of the containers within a pod would have the new version, and we ensured that the end users, because I had two sets of end users, your documentarians and your end user as in the actual user that Rackspace dealt with, they all saw the same thing. So the little bit of canary deployment, one person might not see the same thing, they reload the page, it just works. So I was able to test things in production, aside from all of the testing that we did earlier in the pipeline. But without a map, I would never have been able to do this. We ended up getting this out into production right before I left the team, because, of course, I was not the last person working on this. The last person working on this that I know of, they're still there. They're still trying to make this thing even more modern than we already started with. But it worked. You can do everything you might want to do with some of the newer systems with your legacy pipeline. So in the end, remember, legacy is just a label. It's just what people say about a pipeline that is out there, it's unmaintained, it's outdated, it's not necessarily old, but it's not working exactly as you expect it to. I'm really excited to hear more about discussions today, to hear what you guys have dealt with legacy pipelines, to hear what challenges you've had and what kind of information. If you have it, I hope you're going to come up for the discussion. But other than that, you can find me on Twitter. I'll be here at the conference. You can check out the blog that I have posted up here. And thank you so much for your attention.
All right, we still have a few minutes if you're open for questions. Are there any questions from the room for Laura?
Don't be shy. I don't bite much.
It looks like we have one down here. Oh, let me get a mic too.
How did you put Docker with, how is Docker within Docker? How do you do that?
Okay, so the question was, how did Docker within Docker work? The short answer is don't do it, ever. So there, you just want to know how it happened? So what I didn't go into is that dconst was built before Kubernetes was a thing, and Docker within Docker was like a concept people wanted to try. So we built Ansible playbooks that were doing Kubernetes without Kubernetes and orchestrating through these manual triggers of Ansible playbooks. And then the Docker within Docker setup was, we used, there's a little tiny open source project that has since become defunct that was setting up Docker within Docker on CoreOS only. It's really weird. I'll have to find the code and show it to you, but it was messy. Let's just say it was really, really messy, and it worked for what it was expected to be. At the time, when it first started, there was no ability to do that. I know. We found out later all of the security vulnerabilities and all the craziness that it caused. We didn't know at the time, so I guess I can't believe I'm making this joke. Hindsight is 20/20. I hear the groaning. So, in any event, there's about Docker within Docker. So, any other questions?
What other questions do you have?
I was just going to comment on what you said about Docker and Docker. Were you redirecting the Docker socket internally to how Portainer does it, for example? Or were you doing something like where they had D&D, which is some other plugin for Docker and Docker?
I think it was a plugin.
Oh, okay.
It's been so long, and I've blocked it out of my memory because it just had such horrible, horrible memories to it.
The plugin was terrible.
The plugins are terrible,
Yeah.
yes. The plugins are definitely terrible. So, Don't do it. For anybody listening, please don't do that. As the next dev who's probably going to get handed that pipeline, please don't. I beg you. Anybody else?
So, what challenges are you facing in this area? That is our first question. And if you'd like to answer that question, just make yourself known. We'll put a microphone in your face, and you can say some words.
Are you ready? Or no?
I had a little bit of a non sequitur from that, but it's sort of a challenge, I guess.
Sorry, I had a little bit of a non sequitur, but sort of the question would be, or the thing to talk about is, I thought it was really interesting about the way you changed the pipeline, and that's a thing that I think we've been struggling with, is trying to figure out how to go to things that make it not be like more legacy in the future, and how you decide what of those things you should change. Yeah, we have that issue.
Great. Yeah, go.
I was going to say that I don't think you can build a pipeline that's not going to be legacy in the future, but you can choose a little bit what your legacy is going to be. And I think I've seen in the past, cases where stuff kind of gets overgrown, and then you kind of have to go through and like clear out and say like, okay, why are we using this? And is this still the best tool for the job? But it's really helpful to have small units where you can do that with, as opposed to having a legacy pipeline where everything connects to everything else. Like in your example, oh, hey, it turns out that the login and development password is needed by production for any reason whatsoever.
Also, just a quick comment. Make sure that you document everything, too. So when you're looking at modernizing and changing things, the next person down the line is going to hate you if you didn't leave any type of documentation at all. Even comments in code, please. I'm begging. Please do that.
On to that point, if you are the next person, if you haven't looked at it in 6 months, it might as well have been written by somebody else.
Yeah, the phrase that I like is be kind to your future self.
So a couple of things we've run into are privilege separation, and what systems should have what scope to change what, and whether central ownership is a good idea or a bad idea. In particular, we've had things where an exec will say, no, there's going to be one team that owns all of this, and then all the other dev teams say, but what about my opinion? And so that's been a challenge.
I hear this from teams all the time where they centralize for efficiencies and stuff, and especially in the enterprise where they want to control things. And I think the only way that it works is the sort of mandated version of whatever you're using, the commandments that come down from the mountain. They have to be easier to use than the alternatives, right? Or else people will just go around them. Or they'll complain, right? So there has to be a carrot attached. Right. There has to be value in whatever they choose to standardize on. And if there's not, if you're looking at alternatives and you always lose the battle of this versus what we could be doing, then you're going to have a bad time.
So I think the discussion before on dependency management resonated with me as one of the biggest challenges that we have in kind of a medium-sized company that's been doing this for a long time. I think trying to make that dependency management cleaner, being aware of your dependencies that are downstream so that you can anticipate things that are going to break what you're responsible for. One of the most challenging kind of solutions to that has been, how do I subscribe to what other people are doing that I'm dependent on? How do I become aware that some other team has made a change to something that's going to break my stuff? And that's been a big project management kind of nightmare for us.
Regarding that, I would say it's a lot like managing code dependencies in a lot of ways. So I don't know how many people here know the Node community, but there was a big controversy maybe like 3, 4, 5 years ago about the left pad app. And so essentially, short version, a developer didn't like what the NPM group was doing, so they pulled their app that was relied on by thousands and thousands and thousands of packages, and it broke many, many, many production systems. And you can look it up if you want. It was called the left pad controversy. But if you think about your pipeline a lot like managing dependencies in a code base, you can sit there and go, okay, well, how can I mitigate the issues that I have with someone else owning this dependency? Well, maybe you code it out. Maybe you write your own version, which isn't always the best thing in an enterprise environment, I know. But also, when you think about it, is there a way to provide yourself with some backup? So that's just some things to think about.
We can do one more, and then we'll move on.
I was just going to say that one thing, or a couple things that I've seen that are kind of trending in the right direction are the idea of like service catalogs and capability mapping, where people are designated to owning specific areas and their skill level is known and the resources that they have are known. And then as we move towards treating everything as a product, whether it's internal or external, and everything is treated as a first-class product, keeping track of that, I think, becomes a little bit easier, but it's like the things that are hidden because no one thinks that they're important to other people are where you'll see those gaps, right?
Cool. So thanks for sharing on that. And so I'd like then to move on to our next question, thinking about legacy and the legacy mindset. What successes have you had in this area? And just before we solicit our first responder, if you chose to stay where you were, and then you have something to share and feel bad that you didn't move down, and now you feel like it's too late, just raise your hand. Joe or I will come to you. You can stay where you are. We'll facilitate it. Also, I mean, you're also welcome to come down. We'd love that. All right. So, what successes have you had in this area?
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to also sort of follow on with the last piece, but I've been really impressed with the power of vendoring or copying in the bits that you depend on when they come from outside your organization. I think that's one of those carrots that if you're trying to standardize, saying, hey, look, we'll maintain a vendored copy of all the NPM stuff that people need, so you don't have to worry about your build breaking when you've got an urgent security fix because somebody got mad and took their code off of NPM. We have a local copy of it. And so, it's great to have all these, I can pull code from anywhere, but it's also nice to be able to say, no, actually, I'm going to keep my own copy and I'm going to be a little defensive about, relying on code out from the internet.
I think one of our biggest successes has definitely been with speed when we're kind of retooling and modernizing our legacy pipelines. Again, when you have systems that have been in place for a decade with people coming in and out of a company and kind of contributing small bits and pieces there, and you end up with these pieces of logic where you have, scripts that are wrappers for other programs that kick off another thing, and you got all this just kind of cruft that builds up for so long. Just going back in and simplifying it for complexity's sake, we usually find that we get massive, massive performance and speed benefits out of that as well.
I would say one success that we actually had at a prior company, I'm not going to name who it is, just for reasons, I guess, was for all of the different legacy pipelines we had around, we made sure we all standardized on the same tech stack. And I know that doesn't really sound like much of a success, but what it did was it enabled a lot of people to move around so that we got a lot of business value out of the one solution that worked for everyone. It took a lot of discussion to get there, but the big success was getting there and then finding out just how much we were able to save and make our company better.
So at my company, we took a legacy app that was lost as an orphan, actually deployed into a different AWS zone than everything else. And as a hackathon project, the SREs wanted they wanted this able to be deployed, a pipeline, and to be able to go out, deploy it, and someone to own it also. So we took it was this little tiny app, and it was a nice project of like building a pipeline for it, testing it out. It wasn't working very well in production, so what we made was better, using the same code base. And then when we got done and had it out into the system, we realized that there was errors in the app that was calling to it, which was nice because then we knew where its home was. And then we said, here team, we found a lost one. Have it back. Which is really lovely. It has a home now.
It's not your home.
It's not with me. No.
Thank you. I just wanted to boast on behalf of one of my clients. I have a client I've been working with for a couple of years, and when I started working with them, they build scientific instruments and the software, the whole stack of software from interfacing to the hardware all the way up to the applications that interpret the data from these scientific instruments. And they hadn't been able to release any software for 5 years. And they are going, it's a fairly large organization, they're going step by step through this process, and they've been adopting the practices of continuous delivery. They're now at the stage where they can reliably release every 3 months, and that's a huge step forward for them. So it's not what we'd think of as kind of leading edge for continuous delivery, but the whole vibe in the organization has changed as a result of their being able to work this way. One of their guys said to me last year, they feel like they fixed the future, which was very cool. And there's a long way to go. There's lots of stuff to do. They're not at the bleeding edge, but it's the sort of realizing that this is a lengthy process and incremental change is important. It is really important to be able to succeed in this game, I think.
Hey, so this is about 10% my success, 90% one of my employees' success. But I think the technique is really useful. I had a person start about 7 months ago now, right? And I did this with all my new people. I block time out, right? I tell them to find the things that bug them that aren't bugging me anymore, and I take advantage of that. There's this cliche that people take 3 months, 6 months, a year to ramp up, but the flip side of that is they are incredible for seeing all the little irritants that you don't notice because you've already built the pearls around them. Like, it's literally part of my onboarding is making sure that every new employee I get has time to take. If they want to take time to fix something, they should, and I'll block that out for them, and then I'll support them for the other 50% of really making that production.
All right. And now for our third question in our discussion. You are all now wizards. You have a magic wand. So what do you want to see in 2 to 5 years? And I'll remind you that what you want to see is not what are you going to build. I want you to be as open-minded as possible. Imagine that someone else is going to build this for you. So what does our future look like?
I would just love to see that whole hunting for documentation and sort of like trying to collect as much info as possible and never really knowing whether you have it all go away, and sort of have some kind of system or process that collects that background data so that we can kind of do the forensics or not have to do them in the first place, right?
So one thing I'd love to see is kind of across the next 2 to 5 years, and that's more teams doing open development, at least within their group, because it makes it so much nicer for all of the legacy teams who have to then take up all of your stuff. So please, open development.
I'd like to see us agree on excuse me. I'd like to see us agree on what a cellular architecture actually means for high availability and gradual releases and so on, because, lots of people think of it at different layers, like, oh, it means that I'm using different cloud providers, or I'm using different regions and they're running different software, or some people think it means, I have 2 different versions of the same software that I'm doing weighted a delivery to within a given stack. It would be great if we had, some agreement on what the trade-offs are between all of those different models as far as being able to deploy quickly and safely.
My favorite definition of legacy code, forgive me, my favorite definition is Michael Feathers, which is code without tests. So in the next 2 to 5 years, I'd like to see there be no legacy code.
I think one thing that I'm interested in, and I don't know exactly what it would look like, is how to get more of these pipelines to be declarative in the sense that, there will be some steps where you have to go and run some code, but it's clearly defined which parts are framework that you can just treat like data. You can, just do a drawing and it will like tie all those things together. And then little places where you go out and you're like, I need to run a little bit of code here, but it doesn't get entangled with everything else because there's some kind of barrier that keeps it from, going on and setting the environment for all future calls or something strange like that. And I don't know what that would look like, but I would really love to have one of those.
I'd like to see a lot more work on reproducibility in build systems, because I feel like it makes it really easy when you're looking at something that hasn't been deployed in a year to like change one thing and make sure like what actually happens, that you caused that change as opposed to just some random thing from the environment. So I think that would be good.
Another thing that I've seen once so far is continuous delivery for continuous delivery. So continuous delivery for your build system, which I think goes to the thing that you're talking about. And I did that once, and I think once you really start drinking the Kool-Aid and thinking that continuous delivery is important, it's your only channel to production, and therefore it's strategic. And so protecting it with the same disciplines is important.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I used to work on this tool called GoCD. I was the product manager for that, and it was a continuous delivery tool that we delivered using continuous delivery. But what we quickly realized when our customers started using it was that was critical, mission-critical production infrastructure. And if you can't get things into production, and you have something bad happen, that's really serious.
Sorry. For a very long time, I think it was kind of shameful that what we think of as continuous integration tools, you couldn't really version control very well. They were hopeless to version control. They're getting better at it now, but this stuff's important.
All right, well, we're sorted then. That's legacy gone. Perfect. Well, let's have a round of applause for Laura and for yourselves for participating in our discussion. All right, so next up on our conference agenda